Part 1A Crimson Omen over St. Mary Mead. The heart of St. Mary Mead did not beat to the frantic rhythm of cities or the grand march of empires. Its pulse was a slower, more ancient thing, measured in the gentle decay of autumn leaves and the slow creep of twilight shadows across the village green. But on this Halloween Eve, the familiar rhythm had faltered. The very air, thick with a sense of wood smoke and damp earth, seemed to hold its breath. A profound and unsettling silence had fallen, broken only by the distant, excited shrieks of children whose instincts had not yet learned to fear the true oddity of the evening. It was a silence that felt less like an absence of sound and more like a presence, a waiting. From a position in the garden of her rose-clad cottage, Miss Jane Marple observed this change with the keen, analytical focus of a naturalist studying a strange new species of beetle. Her hands, usually occupied with the soothing, repetitive motion of her knitting, was still resting on the polished silver handle of a walking cane. The knitting itself, a soft grey muffler, lay forgotten on a wrought-iron garden chair beside her. Her sharp, pale blue eyes, set deep in a face webbed with the fine lines of 8 decades of quiet observation, were fixed not on the quaint thatched roofs or the familiar Gothic spire of the church, but on the sky. It was wrong. The gentle lavender and soft orange of a typical autumn sunset had been usurped by a sinister, coppery glow. The moon, a day from full, hung heavy and immense on the horizon, but it was no longer a clean, silver disk. It was a wounded orb, a great, bloodshot eye staring down at the village with a baleful, reddish light. A hunter's blood moon, the vicar would later call it. A lunar eclipse, a trick of celestial mechanics and refracted light. But to the primal core of the human soul, and to Miss Marple's profound understanding of symbolism, it was an omen. It painted the world in shades of rust and dried blood, transforming the comforting geometry of the village into a scene from a Gothic folk tale. A creeping mist, unnervingly timed, began to uncoil from the damp earth of the riverbank, sliding between the headstones in the churchyard and weaving ghostly fingers through the legs of the children who darted across the green. They were early, these little ghosts and goblins, their homemade costumes of sheets and paper masks looking spectral and strangely authentic in the hellish light. Their laughter had a nervous, brittle edge to it. They felt it, too, the wrongness, though they could not name it. To them, it was simply a wonderfully spooky Halloween. Miss Marple's gaze, however, was drawn to a more terrestrial disturbance. Beyond her low hedge of boxwood, in the garden of the mill house, a furious struggle was underway. Her new neighbor, Mr. Julian Croft, was a man perpetually at war with his environment. Tonight, his enemy was the ancient, gnarled wall of blackberry brambles that separated their properties. The brambles, once cultivated by the property's previous owner, Old Man Hinckley, had long since declared their independence. They were a thorny, grasping thicket, and they had snared the expensive leather of Mr. Croft's glove. Blast and confound this infernal village and its wretched vegetation, he snarled, his voice cutting through the eerie quiet. His face, tanned from years under a foreign sun, was flushed with anger. He was a man of sharp angles and impatient gestures, a human exclamation mark in a village of gentle ellipses. Miss Marple watched his struggle with clinical detachment. It was, she thought, a perfect metaphor. Mr. Croft had arrived 6 months ago with his modern ideas and his loud opinions, determined to tame, to prune, to modernize. But St. Mary Mead was not so easily tamed. Its roots were deep, its secrets well protected by thorns, both literal and metaphorical. His frustration with the brambles was merely the physical manifestation of his broader failure to impose his will on the village itself. A soft footfall on the gravel path announced another presence. A troubled sky for troubled earth, it would seem, murmured Reverend David Hastings, the young vicar. He stood beside Miss Marple, his kind, often worried face tilted upward, his clerical collar a stark white against the deepening crimson of the sky. A hunter's blood moon. Quite a spectacle. "It is indeed, Vicar," Miss Marple replied, her voice quiet. "The children are quite taken with it. They say it makes their games feel more real." "It is science, of course," the vicar said, as if reassuring himself. "The earth's shadow, the refraction of light, perfectly natural." Yet his eyes held a shadow of the old superstitions, the knowledge that for centuries such an event had been seen as a portent of death and great change. From his tangle of thorns, Mr. Croft let out a derisive snort. Science or sorcery, it's a damn nuisance. This whole night is. Can't see a thing properly. This red light plays tricks on the eyes. He finally ripped his glove free with a tearing sound, glaring at the brambles as if he would gladly incinerate them on the spot. If you'll excuse me, I've had enough of this atmosphere. Paperwork is at least predictable. He turned and stalked toward his own house, a modern, angular structure whose large, dark windows seemed to absorb the bloody light. It stood in stark contrast to the older cottages, a sleek, sleepless predator among sleeping sheep. The vicar watched him go, his frown deepening. He is not settling in well, I fear. He had another dreadful row with Colonel Prescott this morning. Something about the Colonel's spaniel and a flower bed. The language was uncharitable. The Colonel does not take kindly to being challenged on what he perceives as his domain, Miss Marple observed mildly. And Mr. Croft does not take kindly to anything. It is a volatile combination. After the vicar had murmured his good nights and drifted back toward the vicarage, Miss Marple remained. The silence closed in again, heavier now. The blood moon climbed higher, its coppery light intensifying, casting long, distorted shadows that seemed to crawl and writhe. The mist thickened, swallowing the base of the church spire. It was then, in that heightened, painterly gloom, that she saw the final, telling detail of the evening's composition. A figure, slight and furtive, detached itself from the profound shadow of the churchyard's ancient yew tree. It was a woman, her head covered by a dark shawl, but her gait, a quick, nervous, almost guilty step, was as familiar to Miss Marple as her own reflection. It was Lily Truscott, the young wife of the village butcher, and she was not, Miss Marple noted with a quiet, internal sigh, taking the direct path home to her husband in the warm, meat-scented kitchen above the shop. Instead, she slipped like a wraith into the lane that led directly to the back garden of the mill house. To Mr. Croft's house. Of course, Miss Marple thought. The patterns were so consistent, so tragically human. The abrasive newcomer, the unhappy young wife, the cuckolded tradesman. It was a story as old as time, playing out once more under a sky the color of heart's blood. The blood moon was not just an astronomical event. It was a stage light, illuminating the players in a drama that was, she felt with a sudden, cold certainty, moving swiftly toward its final act. The omen was not in the sky alone. It was here, on the ground, in the secrets and passions of the people of St. Mary Mead. And as she turned finally to go inside, the old grandfather clock in her hall began to chime, each note seeming to fall like a hammer on the anvil of the coming night. Part 2. The Body and the Bonfire. The unnatural silence of the blood-drenched night was shattered by the crackle of flame and the rising murmur of a gathering crowd. On the far edge of the village green, where the land sloped down towards the old mill stream, the great Halloween bonfire had been lit. It was a tradition in St. Mary Mead, a ritualistic burning of the season's deadfall and prunings, a symbolic cleansing before the long winter sleep. But this year, the flames did not dance with their usual golden cheer. Fed by the strange, desiccated branches and the unnerving atmosphere, they roared to life with a violent, hungry intensity, burning in unnatural hues of lurid green and deep, angry orange. The fire seemed to feed on the blood moon's light, becoming a twisted mirror of the sky, a hellish pit of churning light at the village's very heart. Miss Marple, drawn by the noise and the disturbing quality of the firelight, had wrapped her shawl more tightly around her shoulders and ventured out, her cane tapping a soft, deliberate rhythm on the cobbled path. She joined the periphery of the crowd, a collection of dark silhouettes against the inferno. Their faces, illuminated by the flickering, sickly light, were a study in conflicting emotions. The children, who had been nervously excited before, were now truly frightened, clinging to their parents' legs. The adults wore masks of forced jollity, trying to uphold a tradition, but their eyes were wide and unsettled. The bonfire was the center of the village's Halloween, but tonight it felt less like a celebration and more like a sacrifice. Her gaze, ever analytical, swept the scene. She saw Colonel Prescott, his military posture ramrod straight, standing a little apart from the others, a flask in his hand, his eyes fixed on the flames with a grim satisfaction. She saw the vicar, Reverend Hastings, moving through the crowd with a placating smile, but his hands were clenched, his brow furrowed in concern. And she saw Lily Truscott, now without her shawl, her pretty face pale and strained, standing close to her stout, red-faced husband, the butcher. But her eyes, Miss Marple noted, were not on the fire or her husband. They were darting towards a dark path that led from the green to the mill house, a look of pure, undiluted terror in their depths. It was a butcher, Tom Truscott, who voiced what others were only beginning to sense. He was a large, practical man, his senses honed by his trade. He sniffed the air, his head cocked. "That's a queer smell," he boomed, his voice cutting through the chatter. "That ain't just wood smoke. Smells, chemical-like, and something else. Something foul." A murmur of agreement rippled through the crowd. The air was wrong. Beneath the scent of burning pine and leaf mold was a sharper, more acrid odor, a hint of roasting meat that was sickly sweet and profoundly unsettling. It was then that the flames, surging upwards in a sudden gust of wind, parted for a moment, revealing the heart of the pyre. The structure of the bonfire had been carefully built around a central core of old furniture and broken crates, and for a split second, the configuration of the burning timbers looked unnervingly like a crude throne. And seated within that throne of fire was a figure. A collective gasp, sharp and unified, tore from the crowd. The figure was Mr. Julian Croft. He was propped upright, his head lolled back, his eyes wide open and staring sightlessly at the bloody moon. His smart jacket was smoldering, his skin already blackened and blistering from the intense heat. But it was not the fire that had killed him. Protruding from the center of his chest, its ornate silver handle glowing in the hellish light, was a letter opener. It was a distinctive piece, one Miss Marple had seen before on the desk in Colonel Prescott's study. For a moment, there was a silence so absolute it seemed to swallow the roar of the flames. Then chaos erupted. Women screamed. Children cried. Men shouted, surging forward uselessly as the intense heat drove them back. The bonfire was no longer a festive pyre. It was a funeral urn, and a public, horrifying one at that. Inspector Slack, who had been enjoying a quiet pint at the pub, was summoned and arrived with a bluster that was quickly subdued by the macabre spectacle. He began barking orders, his men attempting to douse the flames with buckets of water from the stream, but the fire, tainted by whatever accelerant had been used, fought back with unnatural tenacity. Through it all, Miss Marple did not move from her position. She was a still point in the swirling panic, her mind working with a cold, detached clarity. She observed everything. She saw Colonel Prescott's face drain of all color, his hand trembling as he raised his flask to his lips. She saw the vicar close his eyes in prayer, his lips moving silently. She saw Lily Truscott sway on her feet, a hand flying to her mouth before her husband caught her, his own face a mask of confusion and dawning suspicion. But most importantly, she saw the details, the way the body had been positioned, almost ceremonially, within the structure of the bonfire. This was not a body dumped in a panic. It had been placed. The killer had wanted it to be found in this dramatic, horrifying way. The letter opener, a piece of evidence so blatant, so obviously pointing to Colonel Prescott, felt staged. It was too perfect, too convenient. A red herring, or rather, a blood moon herring. As the flames were finally subdued and the blackened, smoking remains of Julian Croft were carefully extracted from the ashes, Inspector Slack zeroed in on the most obvious clue. He stood over the body, his face grim, pointing a gloved finger at the silver handle. "That's Colonel Prescott's," he stated, his voice carrying in the sudden hush. "I've seen it on his desk. A gift from his old regiment." He toned, his eyes scanning the crowd until they landed on the colonel. "Colonel? Perhaps you'd like to explain how your property ended up in a dead man's chest." All eyes turned to the colonel. He straightened his shoulders, his military training reasserting itself, but the fear in his eyes was unmistakable. "Preposterous," he blustered. "That letter opener was stolen from my study. Days ago. I meant to report it." But his voice lacked conviction, and the crowd's suspicion was a palpable force. The pattern was forming, just as Miss Marple knew it would. The public argument, the stolen weapon, the body of the man he despised. It was a narrative as simple and direct as a hammer blow. Yet, as Miss Marple turned her back on the gruesome scene and began the slow walk back to her cottage, she knew it was all wrong. The killer was not a hot-headed old soldier. The killer was clever, theatrical, and ruthless. They had used the blood moon, the bonfire, the villagers' own traditions, as tools in their plan. They had not just murdered Julian Croft, they had staged a spectacle. And as she glanced once more at the fading blood moon, now beginning to withdraw its sinister light, she understood that the real horror was not the body in the bonfire, but the cold, calculating intelligence that had put it there. Part 3. A Web of Lies and Blackberry Thorns. The following morning, St. Mary Mead lay shrouded in a blanket of mundane normality that felt as thin and fragile as cheap gauze. The blood moon had set, leaving behind a sky the color of dull pewter. The bonfire was now a soggy, blackened scar on the village green, cordoned off with police tape that fluttered in the damp breeze like a vain attempt to contain the horror. The air, once crackling with supernatural tension, now hung heavy with a more terrestrial stench of wet ash and whispered gossip. The murder of Julian Croft had ceased to be a spectacle and had become a virus, infecting every conversation, every glance, every quiet moment behind closed doors. In the serene, sunlit sitting room of her cottage, Miss Marple presided over the epicenter of this quiet epidemic. The horror of the previous night had been filed away in a neat mental drawer, and now the practical work of pattern recognition began. Before her, on a small, polished occasional table, lay her tools, not fingerprint powder or evidence bags, but a porcelain teapot, a plate of digestives, and an almost preternatural capacity for listening. Her first visitor was the Reverend David Hastings. He looked as if he had not slept, his youthful face drawn, the shadows under his eyes testifying to a night spent wrestling with the presence of true evil in his parish. He accepted a cup of tea with trembling hands. "It is a dark day, Miss Marple," he began, his voice hoarse. "To think such a thing could happen here, in our very heart, under a celestial sign." He could not bring himself to look directly at her, his gaze fixed on the steam rising from his cup. "Inspector Slack questioned me for an hour. He seemed to believe the colonel is guilty. The evidence is certainly compelling. Evidence can be a loudspeaker, vicar, but it does not always tell the truth," Miss Marple replied, her tone gentle but firm. "It merely says what it is told to say. Tell me, you are a frequent visitor to your parishioners. You have a key to the church, to the hall. Did you notice anything amiss yesterday? Before the bonfire? Anyone where they should not have been?" The vicar shifted uncomfortably. "Well, I did see Dr. Babbage coming out of the church hall rather late in the afternoon. He looked flustered. He said he was dropping off some old medical journals for the jumble sale, but he was carrying a satchel, and it seemed heavy for papers." But Miss Marple did not believe in ghosts. She believed in human greed, human fear, and human fallibility. That evening, as she sat in her chair, the ticking of the clock seeming louder and more portentous than ever, she laid out the facts as she knew them. A girl vanishes. Her locket is found 30 years later. A postman who reacts with terror to its discovery himself disappears after a mysterious note. A wealthy, polished man watches the postman's house from the shadows. A doctor, connected to both the garden and the wealthy man, is drowning in fear, and linking them all, the muddy, shallow grave of a silver locket. The pattern was becoming clearer now. It was a pattern of knowledge and of silence. Someone had killed Eloise Finch. Someone else had known about it, or suspected. And now, 3 decades on, that secret was threatening to erupt, and the people involved were scrambling to protect themselves, their positions, their very lives. Billy Fawcett, she feared, had been caught in the middle. He was not a villain. He was a pawn. And pawns, in her experience, were often the first to be sacrificed. The following morning, the search resumed. But this time, Miss Marple did not stay in the village to listen to the whispers. She put on her stout walking shoes and her warmest coat, and she set out, not for the woods where the men were searching, but in the opposite direction, towards the derelict, overgrown grounds of the old Blackwood Manor kitchen garden, the place where it had all begun. She had a feeling, a quiet, persistent intuition, that the past would not give up its secrets in the daylight, with a crowd. It would only whisper them to someone who was willing to listen, alone. The Whispering Bones of St. Mary Mead, Chapter 4. The old kitchen garden of Blackwood Manor lay not behind the main house, as one might expect, but down a gentle, south-facing slope, separated from the Babbage currant lawn by a low, crumbling stone wall, now almost submerged in a tangle of nettles and ivy. It was a forgotten place, a square of land that time had decided to bypass. The air was still and cold, and the sunlight that filtered through the canopy of the great WYCH elm seemed thinner, paler than the light in the rest of the village. Miss Marple stood at its edge, her hands tucked into her pockets, her gaze sweeping over the scene with the quiet intensity of a botanist searching for a rare and poisonous weed. She did not step into the garden immediately. First, she observed. She noted the recent disturbance where Mrs. Babbage had been digging up her runner beans, the earth still dark and loose. She saw the deeper, more chaotic gouges left by the police search party, their heavy boots having trampled any subtler signs that might have existed. But it was the periphery of the garden that interested her most, the places where the wilderness began to reclaim its own. A path, little more than a memory, led from the stone wall towards a dilapidated, moss-covered structure half hidden by brambles. The old ice house. It was a small, domed brick building, built into the slope of the hill, a relic from an era before electric refrigeration. It was there, near the entrance to this forgotten vault, that her eyes, sharpened by a lifetime of noticing what others overlooked, caught a discrepancy. A single pale green leaf from a sycamore tree lay atop the brambles, but it was not resting naturally. Its underside, a lighter, almost silver hue, was facing up. It had been flipped over recently by something passing through the thicket, and the brambles themselves were not entirely undisturbed. A few of the thorny vines were newly broken, their snapped ends still pale and moist. Her heart, for a moment, beat a little faster against her ribs. This was not the broad, clumsy passage of a search party. This was a single, furtive trail. Steeling herself, and using her sturdy walking stick to push the thorny branches aside, Miss Marple approached the ice house. The old wooden door, rotten and sagging on its iron hinges, was not quite closed. A dark, narrow gap promised entry. A faint, damp, and oath-laden chill emanated from within, carrying a scent of decayed leaves and cold stone. She did not call out. It was a foolish thing to do in the circumstances, and Miss Jane Marple was never foolish. Instead, she leaned closer to the gap, peering into the gloom. It took a moment for her eyes to adjust. The interior was a small, circular chamber, the brick dome creating a strange acoustic that seemed to swallow sound. The floor was packed earth, and there, curled on its side near the far wall, was a shape that resolved itself, with a terrible, sinking clarity, into the form of a man. It was Billy Fawcett. His postman's uniform was rumpled and dirty, and one arm was thrown out as if in a final, desperate reach for the sliver of light from the doorway. He was not moving. For a long, silent moment, Miss Marple stood there, her hand pressed to her mouth. It was not a gasp of surprise, but a quiet, sad acceptance of a truth she had already, in her heart, known. The pawn had been sacrificed. She offered a small, silent prayer for his soul, this kind young man who had been caught in a web-spun long before he was born. Then, the detective in her took over, pushing the sorrow aside to be examined later. She carefully, without touching the door or the frame, widened the gap just enough to see more. He had not been there long. There was no advanced decay, only the pallor of death. There was no visible blood, no obvious sign of a struggle in the immediate vicinity. It looked as if he had been struck down quickly, or perhaps had hidden here and died of exposure. But her eyes, adjusting further, caught a glint of something metallic near his outstretched hand. It was not the locket. It was a fountain pen. A heavy, silver fountain pen, its cap lying a few inches away, as if it had rolled from his grasp. It was the pen she had seen on Dr. Babbitt's hall table. The pen with Sebastian Croft's distinctive logo. The implications crashed together in her mind like waves. Billy had this pen. How? Did he take it from the doctor's house? Had it been given to him? Was it a payment, or a token? Or was it, as her more cynical mind suggested, a plant? A piece of evidence deliberately left to point the investigation in a specific direction. She knew she could not touch it. This was now a matter for Inspector Slack and the proper authorities, however much they might bungle the subtleties. She retreated from the ice house as quietly as she had come, her mind already working on the problem of how to alert the police without revealing her own presence at the scene. A direct report would lead to endless, time-consuming questions and Slack's condescension. She needed an intermediary. She made her way back to the stone wall, and with a careful, deliberate motion. She knocked her walking stick against the handle of a garden shears, which she had brought as a plausible prop for her walk. The metallic clang was sharp and clear in the quiet air. She waited a moment, then did it again, more insistently. Within minutes, a concerned-looking man from the search party, who had been beating the bushes in a field adjacent to the manor grounds, came hurrying over. "Miss Marple, are you quite all right? Have you taken a fall?" "Oh, no, my dear boy, I am perfectly fine," she said, her voice a little breathless, a masterclass in feigned, flustered old age. "But I was just looking for some late-blooming monkshood. It does sometimes thrive in such neglected spots, you know, and I happened to glance into that dreadful old ice house. I do believe, that is to say, I fear I may have seen something. A boot. It looked very much like young Billy's. I do hope I am mistaken, but perhaps one of you strong young men should take a look." It was enough. The man's face went from concern to grim understanding. He helped her over the wall and called out to his companions. The search, which had been languishing, was suddenly re-energized with a terrible, grim purpose. Miss Marple, pleading fatigue and shock, was escorted back to the lane by a young constable. As she walked away, she heard the shouts as the men converged on the ice house, their voices sharp with the macabre excitement of a discovery they had all dreaded. She did not look back. She had seen what she needed to see. Billy Fawcett was dead, and beside his body lay a silver pen that connected Dr. Babbage and Sebastian Croft to this fresh tragedy. The whispers of the past had now erupted into a scream. The 30-year-old secret had demanded a blood payment, and Billy, poor, terrified Billy, had been the first to pay it. But Miss Marple knew, with a cold certainty, that he would not be the last. The killer of Eloise Finch was still here, in St. Mary Mead, and they were desperate enough to kill again to keep their secret buried. The Whispering Bones of St. Mary Mead, Part 5. A dead body, once discovered, changes everything. The abstract fear that had haunted St. Mary Mead solidified into a cold, hard dread with the finding of Billy Fawcett in the ice house. The village was no longer whispering. It was holding its breath. Police constables, their faces set in grim lines, became a permanent fixture, their presence a constant reminder that a killer walked among them. The ice house was now a tomb, cordoned off with ropes that fluttered like ragged flags, marking the spot where the past had finally claimed its first modern victim. From her armchair, Miss Marple observed the aftermath. She had played her part perfectly, the kindly, startled old lady who had stumbled upon a gruesome scene. Inspector Slack, now in his element with a fresh homicide, had barely glanced her way. He was a man who dealt in fingerprints and footprints, not in the subtle echoes of long-dead scandals. He was welcome to his fountain pen. She knew its placement was too convenient, a deliberate piece of stagecraft designed to point a finger away from the true architect of this tragedy. The official word, which Cherry delivered with hushed solemnity, was that Billy had been struck on the head a single, brutal blow. Robbery was not a motive. His wallet was untouched. The pen was the only anomalous item, a shiny, expensive enigma lying in the date. Miss Marple listened, her needles clicking a steady rhythm against the rising tide of village anxiety. The pen was not a clue, it was a message, and she was beginning to understand the language. Her solitude was broken by a timid knock. There, on her doorstep, stood Mrs. Fawcett, her small frame seeming to collapse in on itself under the weight of her grief. Her eyes were raw, her hands trembling. She had come, she whispered, because Billy had always said Miss Marple saw things others missed. And she had a burden, a secret she had carried for 30 years, that she could no longer bear alone. Seated by the fire with a cup of sweet, strong tea, the story emerged, halting and stained with tears. Long before she was Mrs. Fawcett, she was young Lily, a scullery maid at Blackwood Manor. On the night Eloise Finch vanished, Lily had stolen away to meet a young footman in the rose garden. It was there, hidden by the scent of damask roses in the cover of night, that she saw them. Eloise, her hair a fiery banner in the moonlight, was in the old kitchen garden, not with a stranger, but in a furious, passionate argument with the young master of the house, Lawrence Croft. He was home from Oxford, handsome, wild, and utterly out of reach for a housemaid. The scene was one of intense, private drama, a world away from the tale of a girl running off with a gypsy. Miss Marple felt a quiet, definitive click in her mind, as if a key had turned in a well-oiled lock. Sebastian Croft was not merely a new owner. He was a scion. He had returned to his family's seat, not just as a wealthy man, but as an heir tasked with silencing the ghost that threatened his legacy. The locket, surfacing in land that was once his family's, was not an inconvenience. It was a direct threat to his name. But Mrs. Fawcett's confession was not yet complete. Through her sobs, she revealed the rest. Her Billy, with a postman's knowledge of every soul in the village and a young man's thirst for justice, had pieced it together. He had guessed a connection between the locket, the Croft family, and the body it signified. He had, in a moment of foolish courage, confronted Sebastian Croft. He had demanded answers, perhaps even threatened exposure. And for his bravery, he had received a note, a summons to a meeting in the dark. He had shown it to his mother, his face pale but determined. "It's to make things right, Mum," he'd said. They were the last words she ever heard him speak. After seeing the broken woman out, Miss Marple stood at her window, watching the twilight deepen over St. Mary Mead. The pattern was now starkly clear. Lawrence Croft had killed Eloise Finch in a moment of passion or panic. His son, Sebastian, had returned to a village nursing that old, half-forgotten secret, only to have it erupt from the very soil. Billy Fawcett, armed with his mother's memory, had become a lethal liability. But one thread still dangled, loose and puzzling. Dr. Babbage. His fear was too profound, too personal. It was not the abstract fear of scandal, but the specific terror of a man who had dirted his own hands. The answer came to her with sudden, chilling clarity. The locket was merely the marker. When it was found, Dr. Babbage, a man of science and logic, would have known what it meant. He would have gone back, alone, and dug deeper, and he would have found the true remains of Eloise Finch. His panic would have been immediate. The scandal, the grisly discovery on his property, it would have ruined him. So he had moved her. He had taken the bones of the dead girl and hidden them somewhere else, hoping to sever the connection between the locket and his land forever. The ice house? It was a likely temporary tomb. But Billy must have discovered this, too. He knew not only who the original killer was, but also the man who had desecrated the grave. He held two damning secrets. And for that, he had to die. Sebastian Croft was a murderer, protecting his bloodline. Dr. Babbage was an accomplice after the fact, protecting his home and his reputation. The pen was Croft's attempt to shift the blame for Billy's murder onto the doctor, creating a tidy narrative of a blackmail plot gone wrong between accomplices. It was an elegant, terrible theory, but it was woven from gossamer threads of intuition and old memories. To convince Inspector Slack, she needed something he could not ignore. She needed the testimony that had been silenced for 30 years. She needed to find the final resting place of Eloise Finch and let the bones themselves tell the last chapter of the story. Part 6. The Shadow in the Sacristy. The presence of the Watcher in the lane did not frighten Miss Marple. It focused her. Fear was a clouding emotion, and clarity was the only tool she truly possessed. The killer's gaze, meant to intimidate, had instead confirmed a vital fact. She was on the right path. The tangled roots of this case were sensitive, and she had struck one. Now, she must proceed with both purpose and caution, a delicate dance under the watchful eye of a predator. Her first move was one of deliberate normality. The following morning, she attended the village shop, discussed the unseasonable cold with Mrs. Prescott, who was brittle with a mixture of outrage and shame over her husband's arrest, and purchased a new bowl of grey wool. She was a picture of a harmless old lady, concerned with domestic trifles. All the while, her mind was cataloguing the village's mood. The initial relief at the colonel's arrest was curdling into uncertainty. Whispers now suggested the evidence was too perfect, the motive too convenient. Her second move was strategic. She needed to understand the method, not just the motive. The bonfire's unnatural flames and the specific, almost surgical placement of the letter opener suggested a mind comfortable with both chemistry and precision. This pointed her back towards Dr. Babbage, but with a new question. Was his dispute with Croft merely about a land right-of-way, or was it something more? Her steps, that afternoon, led her back to the church. Reverend Hastings, she found, was in the garden, attempting to prune a rebellious rose bush with more enthusiasm than skill. "Vicar," she began, her tone light and conversational, "I was so intrigued by my time in the archives. It put me in mind of old Dr. Babbage, the current doctor's father. He was a practitioner here in the 1920s, was he not? He would have attended poor Eleanor Croft during her final illness. The vicar, sweating slightly from his exertions, nodded. Oh, yes. A fine doctor, by all accounts. His ledgers are in the vestry, too. You know, he kept meticulous notes on all his patients. A historical treasure. Really, though, he added, lowering his voice. Young Dr. Babbage once asked if he could have them back. Said they were family property. I had to explain that his father had bequeathed them to the parish archive. He wasn't best pleased. This was new. A flicker of interest, sharp and bright, ignited in Miss Marple's mind. Why would the current Dr. Babbage want his father's old medical ledger so badly? With the vicar's somewhat reluctant permission, she found herself once more in the cold, silent vestry. She located the box containing the elder Dr. Babbage's casebooks, heavy, leather-bound volumes smelling faintly of camphor and thyme. Her fingers, tracing down the index for 1923, found the entry for Croft Eleanor née Finch, the Mill House. The entry was brief, clinical. October 28, 1923. Attended patient. Symptoms: profound nausea, violent cramping, extreme thirst. Pulse rapid and thready. Pupils dilated. Suspected gastric fever. Prescribed bismuth mixture and bed rest. October 30th, 1923. Patient deceased. Cause: gastric fever. Miss Marple read the entry again, her heart sinking. It was all so vague. Gastric fever was a catch-all diagnosis for a multitude of sins. There was nothing here to prove foul play. But as she went to close the ledger, a loose sheet of paper, yellowed and brittle, fluttered out from the back cover. It was not a formal entry. It was a page from a personal diary, in the same hand, but far less restrained. The 30th of October, 1923. E.C. deceased. I am plagued by doubts. The symptoms were not right for a simple fever. The cramping, the dilated pupils. I recall a case from my student days. A poisoning. Aconitine, the monkshood plant, grows wild in the woods here. But L.C. is a powerful man. He insisted it was a fever. Paid the bill handsomely, in cash, with a bonus for my discretion. What have I done? My oath. I have betrayed my oath. May God forgive me. The paper trembled in Miss Marple's hand. Here it was. Not just a family story, but a doctor's dying conscience, recorded in secret. Lawrence Croft had almost certainly poisoned his wife, and the elder Dr. Babbage had been paid to look the other way. The original sin of a Mill House was not a secret affair. It was murder covered up by a terrified and complicit physician. And his son, the current Dr. Babbage, had tried to retrieve these very ledgers. He knew his father's shameful secret. When Julian Croft returned, digging into his family's past, he must have uncovered this same truth, or come dangerously close. The dispute over the land was not the cause of their enmity. It was the battlefield. Dr. Babbage wasn't just protecting his property. He was protecting his father's name, his own professional legacy, from the stain of a decades-old cover-up that had allowed a murderer to go free. His motive was not anger, but a desperate, terrified need to keep the past buried. The pieces were aligning with a terrible, logical beauty. The killer had knowledge of chemistry, the accelerant in the Bonfire. They had a profound, deeply personal motive tied to the original crime at the Mill House. And they had the cool-headedness to stage an elaborate murder, framing the hot-headed colonel for a crime born of cold, calculated fear. A floorboard creaked behind her. The sound was soft, but in the absolute silence of the vestry, it was as loud as a gunshot. Miss Marple did not startle. Slowly, deliberately, she folded the damning diary page and slipped it into the cuff of her cardigan. She closed the ledger with a firm, final thud and toned. The tall, lean figure of Dr. Babbage stood in the doorway, blocking the light from the church. His face, usually kind and avuncular, was a pale, strained mask. His eyes were not on her, but on the ledger in her hands. "Miss Marple," he said, his voice unnaturally calm. "Reverend Hastings said I might find you here. I see you share my interest in local history. The past is so often the key to the present." "Doctor," she replied, her own voice steady. She picked up her walking cane, using it to rise to her feet, a performance of frailty for his benefit. "I was just reading about your father. He seemed a most dedicated man." A muscle twitched in his jaw. He was. He served this village for 50 years. His reputation was spotless. The words had a rehearsed, defensive quality. "Oh, I am sure it was," Miss Marple said, taking a small step towards the door. He did not move. "It is a heavy burden, is it not, to be the keeper of a reputation? To feel the weight of the past on one's shoulders?" His eyes finally met Hayes, and in their depths she saw not the rage of a killer, but the bleak, cornered terror of a man who had sacrificed his morals to protect a ghost. He knew that she knew. "It can be an intolerable burden," he whispered. For a long moment they stood in silence, the old woman and the doctor, surrounded by the silent witnesses of the dead. The vestry was no longer a repository of history. It was a cage. Then, with a slight, almost imperceptible sigh, Dr. Babbage stepped aside. "The afternoon's drawing so quickly now," he said, his voice hollow. "You should not walk home in the dark, Miss Marple. The lanes can be treacherous." It was not a threat. It was a confession of a different kind, a warning and an admission of defeat. He had shown his hand, and she had seen it. "Thank you for your concern, Doctor," she said, walking past him into the body of the church. "But I have found that the light, however faint, is always preferable to the darkness." As she walked away, she did not look back. She could feel his gaze on her, just as she had felt the watcher in the lane. But this time, the gaze was not that of a hunter, but of a condemned man, watching his last, slim hope of escape walking calmly out of the door. Part 7. The Chemistry of Fear. The walk back from the church to her cottage was the longest of Miss Marple's life. Every rustle of a late-falling leaf, every creak of a distant garden gate, seemed amplified, a potential herald of the desperate act of a cornered man. Dr. Babbage's warning, "The lanes can be treacherous," hung in the air not as a vague threat, but as a specific, chilling promise. He had not tried to stop her in the vestry. The presence of the vicar nearby had made that impossible. But he knew she carried the truth tucked away in her cardigan cuff, a truth that could destroy him. Upon reaching the sanctuary of her home, she did not immediately light the lamps. Instead, she stood in the deepening twilight of her sitting room, watching the lane. She did not have to wait long. Within 10 minutes, the doctor's familiar dark saloon car glided to a halt not outside his own surgery, but further down the lane, tucked discreetly into the shadow of the old forge. He was not going home. He was waiting. A cold clarity settled over her. He would not risk a direct confrontation in her home. He was a man of precision, of planning. He would seek to deal with this as he had dealt with Julian Croft, through misdirection and chemical means. His threat implied an accident, a fall on a treacherous path, perhaps a gas leak, or something more subtle, something that would look like the natural failure of an elderly woman's heart. She needed to force his hand, to control the terrain, and she knew exactly how to do it. She went to her writing desk, took out a sheet of her best notepaper, and in her fine, spidery hand, penned a short, precise note. "Dear Dr. Babbage, our conversation today has left me most unsettled. My researches into the aconitine poison, derived from the monkshood plant, have raised certain questions I feel can only be answered by a medical man. The symptoms, as described in historical cases, are so distinctive. I should be grateful if you would call upon me this evening at 8 o'clock to discuss the matter. I have taken the liberty of also inviting Inspector Slack, as I believe this information may have a bearing on his current investigation. Yours sincerely, Jane Marple." It was a brazen, dangerous gambit. She had not, of course, invited Inspector Slack, but the mere suggestion would send a bolt of pure panic through the doctor. He would be faced with a choice: flee the village immediately, or silence her before this fictitious meeting could take place. A man like Dr. Babbage, rooted in this community, his life's work here, would choose the latter. He would come for her before 8 o'clock. She gave the note to Cherry, her daily helper, who was just leaving. "My day, would you be a lamb and drop this at the doctor's surgery on your way home? It's rather urgent." The trap was set. As the clock ticked toward 7, Miss Marple made her preparations. She did not lock her doors. A locked door would suggest fear and might make him reconsider his approach. Instead, she made the cottage seem invitingly vulnerable. She lit a single lamp in the sitting room, placed her knitting on the arm of her chair, and set 2 teacups and the teapot on a tray. Then, she retreated to the deep shadows of the dining room, which afforded a clear view of the sitting room through the open double doors. She sat perfectly still, her breathing slow and regular, her hands folded in her lap. She was not hiding, she was observing. At 10 minutes past 7, she heard it, the soft, almost inaudible turn of the front door handle. The door swung open without a sound. Dr. Babbage slipped inside, closing it behind him with meticulous care. He stood for a moment in the hallway, listening. The cottage was silent save for the ticking of the grandfather clock. He stepped into the sitting room. He was holding a small, professional-looking leather case, his medical bag. His eyes swept the room, noting the single lamp, the waiting teacups, the knitting, a scene of peaceful domesticity. He believed she was in another room, perhaps fetching a biscuit tin, soon to return. Miss Marple watched as he moved with swift, efficient movements. He did not approach the chair. Instead, he went straight to the teapot. He opened his bag and took out a small glass vial and a hypodermic syringe. He uncorked the teapot and, with the steady hand of a professional, depressed the plunger of the syringe, injecting a clear liquid into the dark tea leaves inside. He then recorked the vial, placed it and the syringe back in his bag, and closed it. The entire operation had taken less than 15 seconds. "Aconitine, Doctor." Miss Marple's voice, calm and clear, cut through the silence from the darkness of the dining room. Dr. Babbage froze, his back to her. His shoulders stiffened, then slumped in a gesture of profound defeat. Slowly, he turned. In the dim light, his face was a ghastly gray. "You were not, I think, prescribing for my rheumatism," she continued, stepping forward into the pool of light. Her eyes were on the teapot. "The same method, perhaps, as your father suspected, was used on Eleanor Croft. A poison that mimics a heart attack. A treacherous lane for an old woman's heart. History repeats itself, but it is so often a pale and sordid imitation." He said nothing. The bag in his hand seemed to tremble. "It was not about the land, was it?" she pressed, her voice gentle but inexorable. "It was about the ledger. Your father's secret. His shame. Julian Croft discovered it, or was close to discovering it. He would have exposed your father as a man who took a bribe to cover up a murder. Your entire life, your respected position, is built on that lie. You could not allow that." Dr. Babbage's composure shattered. "He was my father." The words were a ragged sob. He was a good man. He was terrified of Lawrence Croft, of the power he wielded. He made one mistake, one moment of cowardice, and it haunted him to his grave. That vulgarian Croft, that boy, he thought it was a game. Digging update, threatening to smear my father's name across the county for a laugh. He didn't care about the truth. He cared about the power. "So you exercise your own power," Miss Marple said. "You used your knowledge. The bonfire, the chemicals to make it burn with those unnatural colors, a distraction and a purging. The letter opener, stolen from the colonel's study during a routine visit. A perfect red herring. You killed Julian Croft and staged a grand Gothic finale to protect a secret that was already decades dead." "It wasn't dead," he cried, his voice breaking. "It was alive. It was a cancer in this village, and I cut it out. I am a healer. It was a surgical procedure." "No, Doctor," Miss Marple replied, her voice filled with a deep, weary sadness. "It was not surgery. It was murder, and you have just attempted another." At that moment, the front door opened again. Inspector Slack stood there, his face a mixture of confusion and dawning comprehension. Miss Marple's note, with its mention of aconitine and the inspector, had been just specific enough to pique his professional interest after Cherry had mentioned it to the constable on the corner. "Dr. Babbage," Slack said, his voice tight with authority, "I think you'd better explain what's going on here. And I'd like to take a look in that bag." Dr. Babbage did not resist. He simply placed the medical bag on the table, his hands trembling. The fight had gone out of him. The truth, once spoken aloud in the quiet room, had become his prison. As Slack led him away, Miss Marple looked at the teapot, the 2 waiting cups, the peaceful scene that had been a hair's breadth from becoming a death chamber. The chemistry of fear had precipitated one final, desperate act. But the stronger compound, she thought, as she slowly, carefully poured the poisoned tea leaves into the fire, was always a bitter alkaloid of the truth. The Whispering Bones of St. Mary Mead, final chapter. The aftermath of a great storm is often quieter than the calm that preceded it. So it was in St. Mary Mead. The frenzy of the investigation, the shock of the arrests, the grim exhumation of Eloise Finch's bones from their unconsecrated grave, all of it subsided, leaving behind a village washed clean by revelation, but also subtly altered, as a landscape is changed by a lightning strike. The talk, of course, continued, but the frantic, fearful edge was gone. It was replaced by a sober, almost reverent understanding of the darkness that had festered in their midst, and a collective, unspoken gratitude for the light that had finally exposed it. Sebastian Croft, in a cold cell, awaited trial for the murder of Billy Fawcett. His confession, once given, was unwavering. The weight of his family's sin and his own had crushed the fight out of him. He was a broken man, his polished world revealed as a hollow shell. Dr. Babbage, stripped of his reputation and his peace, faced charges of obstructing justice and interfering with a corpse. His practice was taken over by a locum from Market Basing, and he and his wife were said to be making arrangements to leave the village, their lives irreparably shattered by a secret that was never theirs to keep. For the Fawcett family, there was a grim comfort of closure. Billy was laid to rest in the churchyard, not far from the yew tree that had held Eloise's secret. The entire village turned out for the funeral, a silent, somber tribute to the postman who had, in his own way, been a brave, if tragically naive, seeker of justice. His mother, armed with the knowledge that her son's killer was known, carried her grief with a new dignity. The village would care for her. It was their way. And for Eloise Finch, the girl known only as a Red Finch for so long, there was finally a name, a story, and a proper rest. Her bones, once mingled with the anonymous dead in a pauper's grave after her disappearance was officially recorded, were now identified and given a Christian burial in a corner of the churchyard, a simple headstone marking her existence. The locket, cleaned of its 30 years of soil, was buried with her. The vibrant copper lock of hair within was, at last, reunited with the skull it had once adorned. Through it all, Miss Jane Marple remained the calm, observant center around which this human drama had pivoted. She received no public credit, nor did she desire any. Inspector Slack, in a moment of gruff, professional courtesy, had acknowledged her sharper eyes than most, a compliment of the highest order from him. But the true reward for Miss Marple came in the quiet restoration of order, the sense that the scales of justice, however wobbly, had been balanced. A week after the funerals, on a particularly bright and crisp autumn morning, the vicar paid her a call. Over a slice of cherry cake, he spoke of the profound shock the events had sent through his congregation, but also a newfound sense of community. People were kinder, he noted. They looked out for one another more. It was as if the shared trauma had reminded them of their shared humanity. "It is a terrible business, Miss Marple," he sighed, brushing cake crumbs from his cassock. "But one cannot help but feel that some good has been wrested from the evil. The truth, however painful, is always God's work." "Indeed, Vicar," Miss Marple replied, her gaze drifting to the window where a late rose still clung to its stem. "Truth is a way of pushing through, much like a bulb in spring. One can stamp on the ground above it, but it will always find a way to the light. It is the nature of things." After he left, she sat for a long while in the peaceful silence of her sitting room. The case was closed, the threads neatly tied. Yet her mind, that meticulous filing cabinet, was performing its final act of organization. She saw the whole pattern now, from beginning to end, not as a shocking anomaly, but as a classic, almost predictable human tragedy. The arrogance of the Croft family, the weakness of Dr. Babbage, the vanity of a pretty girl, the courage of a simple postman. She had seen variations of them all in the microcosm of St. Mary Mead. It was, she reflected, all there in the village parallels. Old Mr. Hargreaves in his new waistcoats, a symbol of wealth that outstripped his means. The flighty undergardener's daughter who thought herself too good for the butcher's boy. The pattern was universal. The world, she knew, would see a sensational murder mystery. But she saw a simple, sorrowful story of how the past never truly dies, how it lies in wait, and how the desperate attempt to bury it only gives it greater power. Evil, in her experience, was rarely a grand, theatrical force. It was a quiet, creeping thing, born of selfishness and fear, and it thrived in the silence between polite conversations. That evening, as the clock ticked its patient rhythm and she took up her knitting once more, she felt a deep, abiding sense of peace. The whispers had been stilled. The bones could rest. The village, scarred but resilient, was healing. Outside, the last of the autumn leaves drifted from the sycamore tree. The cycle was turning. Soon it would be winter, a time of stillness and reflection. And Miss Jane Marple, the gentle spinster of St. Mary Mead, would continue to sit by her window, her knitting in her lap, and her keen, understanding eyes watching the world go by. For she knew, with absolute certainty, that human nature was much the same everywhere. And in a village like hers, one had the opportunity to observe it at very close quarters indeed. Part 9. A Pattern in the Poison. The official conclusion of the case was a neat, administrative affair. Dr. Babbage, his spirit broken, offered a full and emotionless confession to the murder of Julian Croft and the attempted murder of Miss Marple. He was remanded into custody, his medical practice shuttered, his name struck from the registers. Inspector Slack, with the tangible evidence of the poison vial in the doctor's own notes, considered the matter resolved. The village, eager for closure, largely agreed. A bad man had done a bad thing, and he had been caught. The mechanism of the law had worked. But for Miss Jane Marple, sitting in her quiet cottage, the mechanism felt incomplete. It was like a piece of knitting where the final row had been cast off too early, leaving a loose thread that threatened to unravel the entire garment. Dr. Babbage's confession explained the how and the who, and it provided a plausible why. Yet, the pattern felt off. The scale of the crime, the theatricality of the blood moon bonfire, seemed disproportionate to the motive of protecting a deceased father's reputation. It was a reason, yes, but was it the only reason? Or was Dr. Babbage, in his despair, protecting something or someone else? Her mind returned, as it so often did, to the poison. Aconitine, monkshood. It was a specific, almost literary choice. Not a blunt instrument, not a common arsenic, but a poison derived from a beautiful, deadly plant that grew in the local woods. It required knowledge, preparation, and a certain flair. Dr. Babbage had it, certainly, but was it the only hand that could have prepared it? A memory, faint but persistent, tugged at her. The day after the murder, she had taken a walk to clear her head, following the path that led past the old Babbage surgery and into the woods beyond. She had seen someone there, someone she had not thought significant at the time. It was a vicar, Reverend Hastings, kneeling by a patch of flora, a small trowel and a wicker basket by his side. She had thought nothing of it. The vicar was a keen amateur botanist, often gathering wildflowers for the church altar. But what if they weren't all for the altar? Quietly, without fanfare, Miss Marple began a new line of inquiry. Under the pretext of researching a piece on the wildflowers of St. Mary Mead for the parish newsletter, she spent an afternoon in the church hall, looking through the vicar's pressed flower collection and his gardening journals. He was a meticulous recorder, and there, in a journal entry from the previous summer, she found a pressed, purple-blue flower, unmistakably monkshood. The notation beside it was chillingly casual, Aconitum napellus, a vigorous patch found in the bluebell wood behind the surgery. A most dramatic and toxic beauty, handled with utmost care. The vicar knew. He knew exactly what it was and where it grew. He had the knowledge. But what could possibly be his motive? She thought of his demeanor throughout the ordeal. His profound unease, his attempts to explain away the blood moon, his presence at the scene of the crime, his quickness to confirm Dr. Babbage's flimsy alibi. She had interpreted it as the anxiety of a gentle soul confronted with evil. But what if it was the guilt of a collaborator? The pieces began to shift, forming a new, more terrifying picture. Dr. Babbage had the means and a motive. The vicar had the knowledge and the access to the raw ingredient. What if they were not two separate strands, but a single, twisted cord? That evening, she paid an unannounced call on the vicarage. Reverend Hastings answered the door himself, his face pale and strained. The cheerful botanist was gone, replaced by a man weighed down by a terrible knowledge. Miss Marple, he said, his voice barely a whisper. I wondered if you would come. He led her into his study, a room lined with books on theology and horticulture, a jarring combination under the circumstances. He did not offer tea. He simply sank into a chair, his hands clasped tightly together as if in prayer. "The monkshood in your journal, Vicar," Miss Marple began, her voice soft but implacable. "You knew what it was. You knew its properties." He flinched as if struck. It is a part of God's creation. I study all of it, the beautiful and the deadly." "You also knew," she continued, "of the history of the mill house. You helped me access the archives. You knew about Eleanor Croft's death and the doubt surrounding it. You knew about the blackmail. You are the keeper of this village's secrets, are you not?" Tears began to well in his eyes. "A pastor is a confidant. I am told things I cannot share." "Dr. Babbage told you something, didn't he?" Miss Marple pressed, her gaze steady. "He was your friend, your doctor. He was tormented by his father's secret, and he shared that torment with you. And when Julian Croft began to dig, when he threatened to expose it all, you didn't just offer spiritual counsel, did you?" The vicar broke. A sob racked his frame. "He came to me. He was desperate. He said that young Croft was a blight, a repeat of his grandfather's evil, and that he had to be stopped. He asked me about the plant, the monkshood. He knew I had studied it. I told him it was a sin to even think of it. But he was so afraid, so angry for his father's memory." "And you told him," Miss Marple finished for him, her heart aching with the tragedy of it. "You told him where to find it. You provided the key ingredient. You may not have plunged in the needle, Reverend, but you handed him the poison. You are an accomplice to murder." "I never thought he would go through with it," the vicar cried, his face in his hands. "I thought the knowledge alone would be a deterrent, a way for him to feel he had some power. But when I saw the bonfire, when I saw those unnatural green flames, I knew he had used something from his surgery. I knew what I had done. My silence, my complicity, it made me a part of it. So that was a loose thread. Dr. Babbage had confessed to protect his friend, the one man who knew the full depth of his family's shame and his own crime. And the vicar, bound by a twisted sense of friendship and his own guilty conscience, had remained silent, allowing an incomplete version of justice to prevail. The case was no longer a simple murder. It was a tragedy of two men, both sworn to vocations of healing and salvation, who had conspired, one in action and one in knowledge, to commit the ultimate sin. The pattern was complete, and it was far more sorrowful than she had imagined. "You must go to Inspector Slack, Vicar," Miss Marple said, rising to her feet. Her voice held no anger, only an infinite sadness. "The truth cannot be half-told. A life was taken. The whole truth is the only penance left to you." She left him there, weeping in his study, a man who had tried to tend God's garden and had instead helped cultivate a poison that had killed a man and condemned his friend. The evil in St. Mary Mead had not been a single monster, but a shadow that had fallen across two souls, corrupting them both. And as she walked home under the cold, clear stars, Miss Marple knew that some scars, once made, would never fully fade. Part 10, a final, quiet stitch. The confession of Reverend David Hastings sent a final, seismic shockwave through the community of St. Mary Mead. If the arrest of Dr. Babbage had cracked the village's foundations, the vicar's admission shattered them entirely. The two men who stood as pillars of the community, one healing the body, the other tending the soul, had been collaborators in a terrible sin. It was a desecration of trust that left the village feeling spiritually homeless. The legal proceedings were swift and somber. Dr. Babbage, confronted with the vicar's statement, abandoned his stoic silence. The full story emerged, not as a grand conspiracy, but as a sad, slow slide into damnation. The doctor, haunted by his father's ghost, had conceived the act. The vicar, in a moment of misguided friendship and weakness, had provided the key piece of knowledge. He had not believed his friend would proceed, but his inaction after the fact made him complicit. The law dealt with them accordingly, their sentences a dry, administrative echo of the moral collapse they had enacted. With the cells locked and the gavel fallen, a deep, exhausted quiet descended upon St. Mary Mead. The frenzy was over. The blood moon had waned, the bonfire's ashes had been washed away by the rain, and the whispers in the lanes had finally stilled, replaced by a hollowed-out silence. Miss Marple observed the village's convalescence from her window. She saw Colonel Prescott, stripped of his bluster, quietly volunteering to repair the churchyard wall, a solitary figure seeking absolution through manual labor. She saw Lily Truscott, her head held higher now, the secret of her lineage no longer a shameful weight but a concluded chapter. She had inherited the mill house by default, as Julian Croft's only living relative, and there was talk of her turning its garden into a proper memorial for the grandmother she never knew. One afternoon, Inspector Slack paid her a final visit. He stood awkwardly in her sitting room, his hat in his hands, a man humbled by events that had proven far deeper than footprints and fingerprints. "I owe you an apology, Miss Marple," he said, his voice uncharacteristically gruff with sincerity. "I had the case neatly wrapped up with the colonel. I would have left it at that. You saw the pattern where I only saw the pieces." "The pieces are important, Inspector," she replied, offering him a cup of tea. "But they must be assembled with an understanding of the material. Human nature is a fragile and often flawed fabric. You look for the tear. I look for the reason the weave gave way." He nodded, a lesson learned not from a manual, but from the quiet wisdom of an old woman who understood the landscape of the human heart. After he left, Miss Marple took her customary chair. The autumn sun was weak but clean, casting long, honest shadows across a familiar room. The grandfather clock ticked its patient, metronomic rhythm, a sound that had witnessed the entire dreadful affair from beginning to end. She took up her knitting, the gray muffler now nearly finished. The needles began to click, a soft, restorative sound in the peace of the afternoon. The case was closed. Justice, of a messy, human kind, had been served. The evil had been rooted out, not from without, but from within the very heart of the community. It was a sobering truth, but a necessary one. A village that believed itself immune to such darkness was a village unprepared for it. As her fingers worked the wool, she thought of the pattern now complete. It was not a perfect pattern. There were dropped stitches of weakness, like the vicar's fatal hesitation. There were knots of long-buried sin, like the original murder of Eleanor Croft. There were threads of arrogance and cruelty woven by the Croft men across generations. And there was a dark, vengeful thread of Dr. Babbage, who thought he could cut out the past with a surgeon's knife. But as she looked at the muffler taking shape in her lap, she saw that the overall fabric, though scarred, was still whole. The village would heal. It would remember, and it would be wiser for it. The silence that now lay over St. Mary Mead was no longer one of dread, but of reflection, of a community gathering its strength, knitting itself back together, stitch by careful stitch. She tied off the final thread and held up the completed muffler. It was warm, serviceable, and flawlessly made. A small, private smile touched her lips. There was, she thought, a great deal of satisfaction in seeing a thing through to its proper end. The whispers had been silenced. The bones could rest. And in the quiet comfort of her own home, with her knitting done and the truth laid bare, Miss Jane Marple finally allowed herself a deep, peaceful sigh. The world, for now, was back in its proper order.